to see this.
What are you doing?
These glasses, they let you see into the third dimension.
Cinema is still a relatively new medium, with only about 150 years between the early Nickelodeons and the latest Netflix movies. Still, it's a history that is full of wild stories of failed formats, gimmicks, and disasters. One of the most notorious formats was Cinerama, which, for my money, is still the single most ambitious idea ever attempted in film. An idea so crazy that literally only about 10 theaters in the entire country were able to handle it. Cinerama was absurd, and there's perhaps no better way to show this than the unbelievable film How the West Was Won. 3 directors, 24 A-listers, and 123 weeks in theaters. To say How the West Was Won was an unprecedented achievement may be an understatement. How the West Was Won was the first of only 2 narrative films ever to be shot in 3-strip Cinerama format, a format that involved shooting a scene with 3 different cameras, one on the left, one on the right, and one in the center. Each camera captures a different angle of the action, expanding a scene from the typical 1.33 aspect ratio to a 2.59 aspect ratio, doubling the film in both scope and scale. For such a huge advancement in technology, studios knew the first film to release in Cinerama would have to be big. So they listened closely when Hollywood legend Bing Crosby approached them with a proposition. Adapt a sprawling tale of the West, showing everything from the Civil War to the Gold Rush. This would be the perfect use for Cinerama, with the beauty of the American frontier on display in pristine condition. It would also allow for more stars than otherwise possible. It was no longer a matter of, should we hire James Stewart or John Wayne? Now, both could star in separate segments, along with literally dozens of others. The film's production was a nightmare, though. Producer Bernard Smith was quoted as saying, "It is essential for our purposes that virtually the whole movie be shot outdoors. Throughout the movie, one of the basic themes is to show little people against a vast country. Huge deserts, endless plains, towering mountains, broad rivers. We want to capture the spirit of adventure." This meant that in addition to the troubles of shooting outdoors instead of enclosed sets, there were the added troubles of shooting with 3 cameras and with hundreds of extras. Because the Cinerama camera was so massive, it meant directors had to be restrictive in camera movement. It was not possible to get a close-up. And of the film's 3 directors, it should come as no surprise that the one that struggled the most was John Ford. If you remember from our John Ford episodes, Ford was always a bit of a curmudgeon, and adapting to this new style of filmmaking was not something he saw much interest in. Most of Ford's footage was unusable, as he would constantly stand in front of the leftmost camera as a way to get closer to the action, the modern-day equivalent of accidentally sticking your thumb in front of your phone camera. And let's discuss these hundreds of extras. Of course, there were stars like Stewart, Wayne, Debbie Reynolds, or Carol Baker, but this was a story that depicted the rivers, the plains, the Civil War, and the building of the railroad. It spanned nearly the entire 19th century, and thus, it needed a lot of background faces. Like most movie sets, these background faces were not subject to the same star treatment as Baker or Reynolds, and long, hot days filming in the American West took their toll on actors, stuntmen, and animals. One stuntman who felt the full force of this mistreatment was Bob Morgan, who fell off of a moving train while filming a stunt and was crushed under a cart of logs. He ended up losing a leg in this stunt, and it made the final cut of the film. To add further issues to production, MGM realized during production that the film was too meandering and lacked cohesive tissue, ordering reshoots involving principal stars Debbie Reynolds and George Peppard as a way to tie the end of the film to its beginning, and ballooning the budget of How the West Was Won to a staggering $12 million. In episode 1 of When the Pictures Got Bigger, we discussed that Cinerama was one of many gimmicks introduced into films as a way to keep viewers in theaters and away from their televisions at home. So, with that considered, how did Cinerama do in achieving that goal? How the West Was Won may have been the first Cinerama narrative film, but it was not the first Cinerama film, period. That honor was bestowed a decade earlier, in 1952, to the documentary This is Cinerama.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is Cinerama.
Which opened on an unbroken ride on a roller coaster and which proved to audiences everywhere you're not getting this immersion in your living room. In many ways, it's similar to the battle we see today between streaming and films that demand your attention in theaters. There is nothing like seeing a movie on the big screen, and audiences were in love with This is Cinerama. The documentary, which showed exotic locations and cultures in a new light, remained in select theaters for 99 weeks straight. It was followed 3 years later by 1955's Cinerama Holiday, which followed a real married couple from America on a vacation in Europe, and a real European couple on vacation in America. Again, this was a travelogue, but we're inching towards the narrative that How the West Was Won would fully embrace. 1956 gives us Seven Wonders of the World, which showed viewers pretty much every natural and man-made landmark out there, from Angkor Wat to Victoria Falls. 1957 had Search for Paradise, and 1958 saw the release of South Seas Adventure. But both travelogues were just more of the same. That isn't a bad thing. We still see people transported to exotic locales in Disney World's Soarin' ride. But theatergoers were ready for Cinerama to enter the world of narrative films, excited to see big stars and big stories. And in 1962, those wishes were granted. Despite the wild successes we've seen for Cinerama films, there were only 2 films ever filmed and shown in the native 3-strip format. We've spent much of this video on How the West Was Won, which came out in 1962, but it was followed that same year by the second and final Cinerama movie, The Wonderful World of the Brothers Grimm. The Brothers Grimm was a film full of fairy tales, trading the vast western landscape for a land of trolls and goblins and elves. Both films appealed to very different audiences, but both commanded the box office and won Oscars. How the West Was Won won Best Story, Best Sound, and Best Editing, while Brothers Grimm won Best Costume Design for a film in color. I fell in love with How the West Was Won on a whim during the pandemic, watching it 3 times within a single month. But I had never gotten around to seeing the Brothers Grimm until this video, and my thoughts on it ultimately mimic the entire draw and drawback of Cinerama. Brothers Grimm is a spectacle to behold. The sets are intricate and large, painting the entire 3-strip screen with sights worth seeing. The stories are engaging, and when you really lose yourself to the world, it's more immersive than anything you've ever seen. The Cinerama process was great for immersion, giving you that same fluttery feeling you get when riding Disney's Soarin'. The feeling of weightlessness, where you forget you're watching a movie and instead lose all concept of time. And when these films are good, they are great. The problem is, in their 2+ hour runtimes, they can't always be spectacles, at the risk of audiences tuning out. If you see Bison Stampede for 30 minutes, it's not going to hit you in the same way it did minute 1 or 2. And so, Brothers Grimm and How the West Was Won only gave audiences spectacle about half of the time. The other half works as exposition, moving the story from set piece to set piece, and it's where the flaws of Cinerama rear their ugly heads. Because of the 3-strip screens, characters are warped and distorted. If a character on the leftmost panel is looking at a character on the rightmost panel, their eye lines do not match, and their audio is out of sync. Also, 3-strip Cinerama required projectionists to input all 3 reels at the exact same second. If they were a little faster on the left strip than they were on the right, the story would be staggered, causing an awful distraction. Luckily, watching these movies on Blu-ray helped to eliminate that issue, but the films lose their true aspect ratio. In order to convert a screen as wild as Cinerama's to home viewing, a new invention termed the smile box was created, which bends the screens into the shape of a smile, keeping the centermost panel closest and the left and rightmost further back. In order to show you the scale of Cinerama, every piece of footage in this video has been in Smilebox. It's still pretty cool, but it's not the original. And if we're going to get into more dry aspects of filmmaking, both Brothers Grimm and the West suffer in the story and direction department. The nature of Cinerama forbids close-ups on melodramatic faces, meaning our story plays out with the objectivity of a stage play. Beyond that, the directors of these films are legendary: John Ford, Henry Hathaway, George Pal, but they have almost nothing to work with, and it's clear they struggle with this new format. The real question you may be asking now is, why were there only 2 Cinerama movies? Like most answers in the movie-making business, it comes down to money. The Cinerama process was expensive, and although these films were wildly successful and popular, their unique screening methods made it so that they could only be shown in a handful of theaters. Your local cinema in Kentucky didn't have the means to screen The West or Brothers Grimm, and so while theaters in Los Angeles and New York were packed showing after packed showing, this limited release didn't justify the cost of the film. And so, a decade after this Cinerama wowed audiences with a roller coaster, the forgotten format became a footnote in cinema instead of the future of it. This is when the pictures got bigger, and I'm focused on shedding light on movies you may not be familiar with, but ones that are worth remembering. If you're interested, check out this video on Rin Tin Tin, Hollywood's first animal A-lister, or this video on the Airport franchise, 4 epic disaster films that could all make up the top 5 worst movies ever made. And until our next adventure through cinema, I'll see you at the movies.